In this world, one moment changed everything. Welcome to Glitchtory. This is the show where history's turning points become launching pads for alternate timelines, where we ask not just what happened, but what could have. Today we step back to August 1964, a U.S. destroyer, a disputed attack, a decision made in haste, or in this timeline, not made at all. Because in this version of history, President Lyndon Johnson chooses restraint, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution never passes, and the United States never goes to war in Vietnam. The ripple effects are vast, from the jungles of Southeast Asia to the streets of Kent State, from the halls of Congress to the lyrics of protest songs. This is a world shaped not by escalation, but by hesitation, and that changes everything. This is Glitchtory, and you're listening to What If the U.S. Never Went to Vietnam? Today, we're not just revisiting August of 1964, we're stepping inside it, into a moment thick with uncertainty, heavy with consequence, a moment when history balanced on the edge of a decision and could have easily fallen the other way. Because sometimes, the most world-shaping changes don't come from what we do, but from what we choose not to do. In this episode, we explore a monumental what-if, a scenario that pivots on that precise crossroads in 1964. What if President Lyndon B. Johnson, staring down a haze of murky intelligence and mounting pressure, chose skepticism instead of escalation? What if, in that critical hour, he leaned into restraint rather than rage? The result? The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution never passes. Congress never gives Johnson a blank check, and America never unleashes full-scale combat troops into Vietnam. And that changes everything. So here's the core question we're tackling today. What happens when a global superpower steps back from the edge of war and simply decides not to fight? And more importantly, what happens next? What ripples outward from that single withheld decision? This deep dive is the opening chapter in our journey through an alternate timeline, a world where the United States never goes to war in Vietnam, where Cold War logic takes a different shape, where American culture, politics, and foreign policy chart a new course. Let's set the scene. It's August 2nd, 1964. The USS Maddox, a U.S. Navy destroyer, patrols the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam. Officially, it's on an intelligence mission, SIGINT, or signal intelligence, monitoring electronic communications, tracking radar, watching movement. But its presence in those contested waters is already provocative. The region is a powder keg. Tensions are sky high. And then, things escalate. That afternoon, 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats surge toward the Maddox, fast, aggressive, and armed. The U.S. ship fires warning shots. The torpedo boats respond with machine guns and torpedoes. American jets scramble from a nearby carrier. It's a real naval skirmish, brief but explosive. And it sets off a chain reaction that would soon lead to one of the most controversial military commitments in American history. Unless it doesn't, because in our alternate path, what happens next? The political storm, the televised outrage, the congressional resolution, it never materializes. That's the fork in the road, and we're about to follow the road not taken. It was a brief exchange, sharp, fast, and over almost as quickly as it began. One North Vietnamese boat was damaged. The others retreated. Crucially, not a single American was killed. And within hours, President Johnson was briefed. Now here's where the story shifts from reaction to escalation. Some of Johnson's closest advisors didn't just see this as a naval skirmish, they saw it as a moment to show strength, a chance to send a message to communist regimes across the globe. Rather than cooling down tensions, they chose to double down. The Maddox was soon joined by another destroyer, the USS Turner Joy. Both ships resumed patrols in the Gulf of Tonkin, now on high alert. Guns manned, radars active, nerves taut. Then came August 4th, and that's when things took a strange, almost surreal turn. That night, the Turner Joy reported another attack. But this time, the details were murky, unsettlingly vague. Sonar operators picked up unidentified blips. Radar screens showed faint shadows. Sailors reported hearing what sounded like torpedoes slicing through the water. Alarms blared. Gun crews sprang into action. Both destroyers opened fire. Hundreds of shells launched into the darkness. But what were they firing at? There were no confirmed visuals. No enemy boats were seen. No damage taken. just shadows and echoes. And as it turns out, this so-called second attack, it probably never happened. Even within hours, cracks began to show in the official story. Pilots flying overhead saw nothing on the water. Sonar operators began second-guessing their own readings. Some blamed storm interference, others suspected human error, jumpiness, maybe even equipment malfunction. Back in Washington, analysts were already raising questions, quietly, urgently, and years later, those doubts would become confirmations. In time, even Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara admitted it. What happened on August 4th was almost certainly a misreading of the situation. The so-called second attack was, in all likelihood, a ghost, a phantom battle. And when the classified documents were finally declassified, they told the same story. There was no enemy. And yet, those uncertainties, those internal warnings, that nagging lack of hard evidence, none of it stopped what came next. Because history doesn't always wait for confirmation. And here's what's truly striking. Despite the immediate doubts, despite the internal confusion swirling behind closed doors, none of that uncertainty made it to the public. Not in time. Not before the momentum took hold. Within 48 hours, President Johnson was on national television. His message was clear and forceful. He told the American people that the United States had been attacked without provocation on the high seas, that this was an act of aggression, and that America had no choice but to respond. Then came the ask. He urged Congress to grant him the power to do just that, to act decisively in defense of U.S. forces and interests. And Congress gave it to him, almost unanimously. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution sailed through both chambers. Only 2 senators voted against it, just 2. With that vote, Johnson was handed something extraordinary, a blank check to wage war in Southeast Asia, without a formal declaration. That resolution was the key, the gateway. It swung the door wide open. In the span of a year, U.S. troop levels in Vietnam skyrocketed, from roughly 23,000 military advisors to over 180,000 full-scale combat troops. And it didn't stop there. By 1968, the American presence in Vietnam had exploded to over 500,000 troops. The war that followed would drain blood, treasure, and eventually public trust in government. But now, let's step through the alternate door. Same moment, same murky reports, same jittery sonar readings and radar ghosts. No confirmed enemy vessels, no damage, no casualties. This time, though, skepticism wins. Maybe Johnson has a gut instinct, or maybe he listens just a little more carefully to those quiet voices, intelligence analysts, ship commanders, radar operators, urging restraint. The few who said, "We're not sure what this was." He sees the gaps in the evidence. No photos, no damage, no proof. And he pauses. That's the decision. The one not made in our world, but made in this one. Johnson delays the speech. He calls for more analysis. "Get me something concrete," he says. And the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution? It never happens. No emergency address, no special session, no sweeping war powers, just silence, just patience. So what does that mean for Vietnam? In the short term, not much changes. American advisors stay on the ground in South Vietnam, continuing their support roles. The simmering conflict continues. But the escalation, that tidal wave of troops, money, and national focus, it never crashes ashore. And even when the hawks in Washington circle, calling him weak, indecisive, soft on communism, Johnson stands firm. He knows the danger of fighting a war without clarity, without an exit, without the support of truth. And in this timeline, the United States chooses not to fight a war it didn't fully understand. And that changes everything. It's incredible to think how one withheld decision, one moment of hesitation, could ripple outward and reshape everything. So, let's bring it home. If the Vietnam War never happens the way it did, what does that mean for the United States itself? The most immediate shift, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. Without the war constantly draining political capital, and, more importantly, budget resources, Johnson's sweeping domestic agenda likely gets a far clearer runway. Civil rights, voting rights, Medicare, Medicaid. These weren't just ideas. They were transformative programs, and in this alternate timeline, they're no longer competing with the noise, urgency, and expense of a foreign war. Education reform, housing initiatives, anti-poverty measures. With less resistance, more public focus, and freer budgets, these pillars of the Great Society might not just survive, they might thrive. And then there's the civil rights movement itself. In our history, it often found itself in the shadow of war, competing for headlines, attention, and political urgency. In this alternate America, civil rights leaders might maintain a sharper national focus. The battle for justice and equality wouldn't be drowned out by casualty counts and jungle warfare. That alone could accelerate progress. Now think about the draft. In the real world, the Selective Service pulled in over 40,000 young men a month at its peak. The draft became a symbol of injustice, of government overreach, of inequality, college deferments, wealth-based loopholes. It was deeply skewed, hitting working class and minority Americans hardest. But in this version of history, that looming threat simply doesn't exist. No war, no draft, no daily fear of being shipped halfway across the world to fight for a mission no one could clearly define. That changes lives. And culture. Consider Muhammad Ali. In our world, he refused the draft on principle. He lost his heavyweight title, was banned from boxing at the height of his career. He became a cultural lightning rod, a hero to some, a traitor to others. But in this alternate timeline, there's no confrontation, no arrest, no ban. Ali keeps boxing, uninterrupted, and perhaps becomes an even bigger global icon, without that singular moment of defiance, but also without that cost. And without the war, there's no anti-war movement. No massive protests sweeping college campuses, no draft card burnings, no Kent State, no National Guardsmen opening fire, no 4 dead in Ohio. That scar, etched deep into the American psyche, never forms. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean protest vanishes. The counterculture still rises. The music, the art, the questioning of authority, it all still simmers. Woodstock still happens. LSD, experimentation, rebellion, they still find their place in American youth. But the tone is different. Without the trauma of war to unify and inflame a generation, the counterculture becomes less about opposition to a specific conflict and more about exploring freedom, identity, and transformation. It's a cultural shift, not a cultural fight, and that shift could define a very different America. In this version of history, the counterculture still rises, but it's defined less by rage and more by exploration. There's still rebellion, still questioning of authority, but it's not fueled by the grief of body bags returning home, or the slow burn anger of a war that never seemed to end. And that shift changes everything, from the soundtracks we remember to the politics that follow. Songs like Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater Revival or Neil Young's Ohio, in this timeline, they're never written in quite the same way. Maybe they tackle different issues entirely. Maybe they don't exist at all. Because the war that gave them such urgency, the fire that made them anthems, is never lit. And then there's the matter of trust. Vietnam fractured something deep between the government and the people. It opened what became known as the credibility gap, a chasm between what leaders said and what Americans believed. That rift grew wider with every contradiction, every body count, every official lie, and it only deepened with the release of the Pentagon Papers. Proof, in black and white, that the public had been misled, systematically. But in this world, that wound never opened so wide. There's still skepticism, yes, but not the bone-deep distrust that would come to define a generation. The sense of betrayal, the idea that America had lost its moral compass, is far less acute. And that changes foreign policy, too. There's no Vietnam syndrome, that hesitance to intervene militarily abroad. The scars that made the U.S. question its own power, its own role in the world, they don't run as deep. America might still be assertive, maybe even more so. Less cautious, less cynical. And what about the generation at the center of it all? The baby boomers still grow up amid profound transformation. Civil rights, feminism, environmental activism, all still unfold. But they don't carry the weight of Vietnam on their shoulders. No sense of having been manipulated into a war they didn't believe in. They're skeptical, sure, maybe rebellious, but not broken, not disillusioned in the same soul-deep way. And that matters, because when you change the psychological makeup of a generation, you change the country they inherit. Skepticism becomes distrust, and distrust becomes cynicism. But in this world, that spiral never starts. And politically, the ripple effect is enormous. In our timeline, Johnson shocked the nation in 1968 by announcing he wouldn't seek re-election. He was exhausted, his presidency consumed by war. But here, without Vietnam dominating his legacy, Johnson likely stays the course. He becomes the president who expanded civil rights, launched Medicare, and chose peace over escalation. And that means no Nixon. In 1968, Nixon rode a wave of backlash against war protesters, civil unrest, and the cultural upheaval of the moment. He campaigned on law and order, on ending a war he hadn't started. But if the war isn't there to begin with, that backlash is far less intense. The chaos, the polarization, it simply doesn't reach the same fever pitch. And then there's Robert F. Kennedy. In our history, 1968 was turbulent and tragic. RFK's campaign was cut short by an assassin's bullet. But in a calmer, less polarized America, without Vietnam tearing the seams, could he survive the political storm? Could he become the Democratic nominee? It's entirely possible. And without the burden of war dragging the party down, he might have a real shot at the presidency. A different face, a different tone, a different future, all because of one moment when America chose not to fight. And here's one last ripple, one more unexpected shift. Without Vietnam to fracture the political center, the Republican Party might stay more moderate for longer. The culture war, so inflamed by the war, the protests, the generational clash, simmers instead of explodes, at least for a while. Maybe the boiling point comes later, over different issues, in a different emotional climate. Now let's be clear, this isn't some utopia. The absence of Vietnam doesn't erase America's deep problems. Corruption, inequality, racism, they don't vanish. Watergate or something like it likely still happens, because power still corrupts. But what's missing in this timeline is that specific psychological break. That disillusioning wound that made millions of Americans question not just their leaders, but the very legitimacy of their institutions. Without that trauma, the emotional blueprint of the nation is different. Future crises still come, but the country meets them with less suspicion, less exhaustion, less moral injury. That's a profound shift, but now let's zoom out. Let's look beyond America's borders. Without U.S. combat troops propping up South Vietnam, what happens on the global chessboard? South Vietnam almost certainly falls, and falls fast. The government there, even in 1964, was already fragile. Corruption, weak leadership, low morale. Without the infusion of American firepower and money, the collapse likely comes sooner, possibly by the end of the decade. North Vietnam, in turn, unifies the country quickly, without years of brutal stalemate and bombing campaigns. And the dominoes nearby? They fall faster too. In Laos, the communist Pathet Lao likely triumphs more easily. Without the secret U.S. bombing campaign and covert intervention, resistance weakens. The communist tide rises with less friction. And Cambodia? The Khmer Rouge likely still emerges, but the path is different. In our world, the intense U.S. bombing campaign, combined with a U.S.-backed coup that ousted Prince Sihanouk, destabilized the country in ways that arguably fueled the Khmer Rouge's ascent. In this alternate timeline, those events either don't happen, or they unfold very differently. So yes, the Khmer Rouge might still rise, but their grip may be weaker, their narrative less potent. The horror of the killing fields could play out under altered conditions. Does it prevent the genocide? Probably not, but perhaps it reshapes it, its scale, its speed, its internal targets. The path is different, and that matters. And then there's China. With the U.S. on the sidelines in Southeast Asia, Beijing sees an opening. China likely steps in to expand its influence through diplomacy, ideology, even aid. A unified Vietnam, fresh from victory, may initially lean toward China. But history is stubborn. The relationship between Vietnam and China has never been easy. Long-standing tension, cultural pride, old rivalries, they simmer beneath the surface. So even in this new world, alignment with China may be short-lived. Vietnam, unified and nationalistic, may seek its own path, and that could lead to new regional balances of power. New alliances, new rivalries, all shaped by a single moment when America chose not to fight. That friction between Vietnam and China, the kind that led to a brief but brutal border war in 1979 in our timeline, might actually surface sooner here. Because a unified Vietnam, emboldened by its own victory, might assert its independence even earlier. And China? It could shift gears, less focused on direct control, more invested in soft power, ideology, and regional influence. And with the United States no longer pouring troops and treasure into Southeast Asia, the Cold War energy doesn't evaporate. It gets redirected. It has to go somewhere. Latin America becomes one of the new focal points. With the Vietnam drain gone, Washington likely rebalances its Cold War playbook, funneling more resources into propping up anti-communist regimes across the hemisphere. The proxy wars get hotter. Guatemala may see even deeper U.S. involvement. In Chile, Salvador Allende probably still wins the presidency in 1970, but this time, CIA operations against him are better funded, more aggressive. Pinochet's coup could happen sooner, or with more open U.S. support. Africa, too, enters the spotlight. It already was a Cold War battleground, but now it's central. Angola's civil war could become far longer, bloodier. U.S. intelligence, money, and maybe even private military contractors push harder into the conflict, trying to keep communist forces at bay. Africa's Cold War struggles don't just stay in the shadows, they hit the front page. And then there's East Asia. With Vietnam off the map, South Korea becomes even more crucial. U.S. military investment likely grows. The alliance tightens. Seoul becomes an essential firewall, an economic and strategic bulwark against communism in the region. Trade deepens with both South Korea and Japan. A more defined line is drawn across Northeast Asia. North Korea watches from across the DMZ, but the balance of power is too clear, too overwhelming to make any move. Because here's the truth we often forget. The Cold War wasn't static. It was fluid. It shifted based on where the superpowers chose to invest. The pressure points were never fixed. The game board constantly changed. And so, in this version of history, the Cold War doesn't end just because the U.S. stays out of Vietnam. It simply changes shape. Vietnam, in our world, became a defining tragedy. A war that cost over 58,000 American lives, left generations scarred, and deeply fractured public trust. But it didn't define the entire Cold War. Without it, the U.S. still engages, still fights proxy wars, but on different fronts, under different headlines. Perhaps with fewer casualties, perhaps not. But the ideological contest remains. The game continues, just on different squares. So let's recap. We've explored a world where the United States never escalates its involvement in Vietnam, where Johnson holds back, where no Gulf of Tonkin Resolution passes, where no combat troops land en masse. The consequences? They're profound. No draft pulling in tens of thousands each month, no generational trauma tied to a war of attrition, no Kent State, no credibility gap yawning wide. Domestically, the U.S. still faces corruption, inequality, injustice, but not the specific wound of Vietnam. The country may be divided, but it isn't broken in the same way. And globally, communism spreads faster in Southeast Asia. That's the cost. South Vietnam falls. Laos and Cambodia follow. The Khmer Rouge still emerges, but perhaps in a different context, under different pressures. There are always consequences, for action or inaction. In this timeline, America avoids the war, but not the cost, just a different kind of cost. And that brings us here, to the biggest questions of all. Because if America never went to Vietnam, what did it become instead? Without the trauma, without the hard-learned caution seared into its national memory, does this alternate United States step into the next crisis faster, harder? What happens when the Shah falls in Iran? When the Soviet tanks roll into Afghanistan? Without the scars of Vietnam to slow it down, does America push forward with more confidence or more recklessness? Does it try to reshape the Middle East with bold conviction, only to blunder into new mistakes? Mistakes born not from fear, but from forgetting? And then there's the even bigger shift, the one no one saw coming. Global terrorism, an enemy without a uniform, without borders, without a capital. How does this alternate America, still powerful, still ambitious, but carrying a different emotional blueprint, respond to that kind of threat? Does it overreach, or does it adapt? These are not easy questions, but they're necessary ones, because once you remove Vietnam from the equation, the entire geometry of the Cold War starts to warp. The dominoes fall in new directions. The end game starts to look unfamiliar. And this This is only the beginning. In our next deep dive, we follow those new dominoes. We leave the jungles of Southeast Asia behind and turn toward the oil-rich deserts, toward Tehran, toward Kabul, toward the long twilight of the Cold War, and perhaps toward a completely new kind of global confrontation, one where the enemy wears no uniform and the battlefield has no borders. The Cold War continues, but the rules have changed. Stay with us, and that brings us here, to the biggest questions of all. Because if America never went to Vietnam, what did it become instead? Without the trauma, without the hard-learned caution seared into its national memory, does this alternate United States step into the next crisis faster? Harder? What happens when the Shah falls in Iran, when the Soviet tanks roll into Afghanistan? Without the scars of Vietnam to slow it down, does America push forward with more confidence or more recklessness? Does it try to reshape the Middle East with bold conviction, only to blunder into new mistakes? Mistakes born not from fear, but from forgetting. And then there's the even bigger shift, the one no one saw coming. Global terrorism. An enemy without a uniform, without borders, without a capital. How does this alternate America, still powerful, still ambitious, but carrying a different emotional blueprint, respond to that kind of threat? Does it overreach, or does it adapt? These are not easy questions, but they're necessary ones, because once you remove Vietnam from the equation, the entire geometry of the Cold War starts to warp. The dominoes fall in new directions. The endgame starts to look unfamiliar. And this is only the beginning. In our next deep dive, we follow those new dominoes. We leave the jungles of Southeast Asia behind and turn toward the oil-rich deserts, toward Tehran, toward Kabul, toward the long twilight of the Cold War, and perhaps toward a completely new kind of global confrontation, one where the enemy wears no uniform and the battlefield has no borders. The Cold War continues, but the rules have changed. Stay with us.